Hi, my name is Adam. In a moment, I am going to recite some words. The words were written by an author. The author calls himself a happy spiritual freedom lover. The author's name is Mo Go Fa Lo. Here now is his published work from September of 2025. We abolished slavery in this country. Once upon a time, a few people concentrated wealth, income, and power into their own hands. The few people ruled over territories. Success attracted competition. The concentration of wealth, income, and power into the hands of the few people made the competition to rule homicidal, genocidal, and even suicidal at times. For that reason, the few people became a few paranoid, oppressive, violent people. The few paranoid, oppressive, violent people had special needs and aspirations. Their special needs and aspirations were achieve and maintain authority, power, order, and control. For that reason, the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people gained influence over religious authority figures. The religious authority figures enslaved communities of faithful believers to the will of the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people. The religious authority figures used a lie. The lie was, we have discovered. These pessimistic myths are truths. A good entity rules in heaven. The good entity is at war with an evil entity. The evil entity rules over the earth. These are the end times. A final, necessary, horrible war will soon be fought. The good entity will have final victory over the evil entity. The good entity will judge all people. The good entity will employ a system of divine eternal reward and abominable infernal punishment. The good entity will find some people observed and obeyed the will of the good entity. These people will be rewarded for all eternity. These people will be elevated to a place of divine eternal bliss. The good entity will find some people disregarded and disobeyed the will of the good entity. Those people will be punished for all eternity. Those people will be cast down into a place of abominable infernal torment. The good entity chose messengers. The good entity revealed words to the messengers. The religious authority figures wrote down the words in a set of sacred scrolls. The words are subject to interpretation and translation. The religious authority figures claimed an ability to know how. The religious authority figures interpreted and translated the words. The religious authority figures proclaimed to communities of faithful believers and anybody else who bothered to listen. These words reveal the words, will, way, and laws of the good entity. Our only hope of salvation from eternal punishment in a place of abominable infernal torment, and our only hope of eternal reward in a place of divine eternal bliss is, do the will of the good entity. Exhibit unquestioning obedience and unswerving loyalty to the will of the good entity. Observe and obey the will of the good entity. The will of the good entity is the will of the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people. The few paranoid, oppressive, violent people are representatives of the good entity here on planet Earth. The few paranoid, oppressive, violent people are divinely ordained to rule over domestic territories. Disregard and disobey the will of the evil entity. The will of the evil entity is the will of the outsiders. The outsiders are representatives of the evil entity here on planet Earth. The outsiders are not divinely ordained to rule over foreign territories. Indoctrination is the process of teaching a person or group to accept and believe in the value of a myth uncritically. Please understand, the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people found the act of indoctrinating communities of faithful believers in a belief in the value of these pessimistic myths enabled the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people. They made themselves into slave masters. They made religious authority figures into slave drivers. They made communities of faithful believers into spiritual slaves. These pessimistic myths included the good entity will reward the spiritual slaves for all eternity. The good entity will elevate the spiritual slaves to a place of divine eternal bliss. For that reason, the spiritual slaves derived joy, faith, and love from their exhibitions of unquestioning obedience and unswerving loyalty to the will of their slave masters. The spiritual slaves derived sorrow, fear, and anger from their discovery of a truth and their belief in the value of a pessimistic myth. The truth is, it appears. One day, the seed body of self will die. The pessimistic myth is, an evil entity rules over the earth. Joy, faith, and love balance sorrow, fear, and anger. Accordingly, the spiritual slaves found they could balance the emotional forces of their minds. From a balance of the emotional forces of their minds, they could find happiness. However, this was the happiness of spiritual slaves. It was only available to those people who were willing to give themselves over completely to being spiritual slaves. Let us suppose some people believed in the value of these pessimistic myths and yet found themselves unwilling and or unable to exhibit unquestioning obedience and unswerving loyalty to the will of their slave masters. In that event, those people would find their hearts would be filled with sorrow, fear, and anger. The misalignment of their values and their behaviors would leave them emotionally conflicted. The few paranoid, oppressive, violent people derived authority, power, order, and control from their spiritual slaves. From authority, power, order, and control, they derived wealth and income. For that reason, the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people counted their spiritual slaves as part of their property. However, the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people were not happy. The few paranoid, oppressive, violent people believed in the value of truths. A truth is. it appears. One day, the seed body of self will die. They believed in the value of pessimistic myths. The three most commonly valued pessimistic myths were: self has only one life to live. Self has only one body to give. Self is only a seed and a body. These were their values. Their values acted upon their emotions. The most powerful emotional forces of sorrow, fear, and anger followed from their discovery of the truth. Their belief in the value of pessimistic myths did not enable them. They were unable to balance the emotional forces of their minds. For that reason, their hearts were filled with sorrow, fear, and anger. The act of having a heart filled with sorrow, fear, and anger was painful. The few paranoid, oppressive, violent people searched for some relief. They settled upon an idea. The idea was: the accumulation of wealth, income, and power into their own hands would enable them. They would be able to balance the emotional forces of their minds. They would be happy. However, the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people found no amount of wealth, income, and power was great enough to compensate them for their discovery of a truth. The truth was, it appears, one day the seed body of self will die. Enough was never enough. The few paranoid, oppressive, violent people wanted to own an ever greater number of slaves. For that reason, the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people had religious authority figures proclaim, "The good entity commands communities of faithful believers. Channel all sexual energy into sex for procreative purposes. Be fruitful and multiply. Work all of the hours of the day from dawn to dusk. Fight against anybody who is not doing the same thing. Fight against anybody who's not believing in the same way." The race in racism is a race to work, fight, and outnumber competition. These commands led communities of faithful believers to exhibit racist, fascist, warmongering behaviors. Centuries upon centuries of these racist, fascist, warmongering behaviors and advances in medical science have resulted in the state of disease in our bodies and the state of disease in our habitats. Population overshoot, pollution of air, water, and land, abrupt climate change, habitat loss, and war could bring about human extinction. Let us suppose wealth, income, and power in some part of the United States of America is currently concentrated in the hands of a few paranoid, oppressive, violent people in something similar to the above-described manner. The few paranoid, oppressive, violent people wish to break off a part of the United States of America and stuff it in their own pockets. The few paranoid, oppressive, violent people wish for this part of the United States of America to secede from the Union. In that event, it would be logical to infer the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people wish to establish a slave empire. Religious authority figures proclaimed, the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people are representatives of a good entity. The good entity chose prophets. The good entity revealed visions of the future to the prophets. Religious authority figures wrote down these visions of the future as words in a set of sacred scrolls. A study of these words reveals their expectations about the end of human history are: these are the end times. A final necessary horrible war will soon be fought. Afterward, the few paranoid, oppressive, violent people will have final victory over the outsiders. We abolished slavery in this country. Their expectations about the end of human history suggest their slave empire will only cause us problems down the road. For that reason, we must resist, oppose, refuse, and negate the establishment of their slave empire.